Hi. One of the important skills that you're going to develop in AP Physics 1 is the ability to write a laboratory procedure. This is a question that often shows up on the AP test. It's also an expectation that as you do labs in the course that you'll get good at writing specific procedures that make sense and that can be followed by other students. We've started to put together a rubric for things to look for in writing these types of procedures, and I would encourage you to just take a look at the rubric. The points that are listed here, there are 6. You first of all have to have an experiment which is conceptually plausible. You want to identify the specific quantities that you'll need to measure. You'll want to identify the equipment that you need. You'll want to describe specific steps to collect the data. You will include instructions to vary an experimental variable. And you also want to make it clear that there are things that can be done to reduce the uncertainty in measurements. So let's take a look at the question. One of the questions that you thought about was to design an experiment to test the hypothesis that the acceleration of a small box sliding down a smooth incline depends on the mass contained within the box. And you have access to the tools found in a common physics lab. This is a very common prompt on an AP test, and oftentimes they let you decide which tools you want to use. So why don't we start off? There's actually there are probably 3 or 4 ways you can do this, and I'd like to just share 2 with you. Let's start off with the motion sensor. So I'm going to underline that. And let's think about an experiment where you could use a motion sensor to measure the acceleration of a box sliding down an incline. And a reasonable thing to do, given our experience so far, would be to probably place the motion sensor at the top of a ramp and allow the box to slide down the ramp in front of it. So one of the things you should do is draw a diagram of this. And you can draw, obviously a ramp in the box, but you also want to identify the motion sensor itself. Okay? And the idea is that the motion sensor is going to be connected to a computer, and that's going to be measuring the velocity time graph, for example. Okay? This is probably the most straightforward way to determine acceleration, because we know that if you measure a velocity time graph for an object, you can take the slope of that graph and find the acceleration. So a diagram like this kind of gives that idea. You don't have to necessarily draw the graph inside the computer like this. You could also say that the motion sensor, used to measure a VT graph. And that would be okay. But the main thing is that you're showing that you're using a motion sensor, you're labeling it, and you're indicating what you're going to use it for in the diagram. Okay, let's take a look at the actual description. So the next part is to describe the overall procedure, including any steps necessary to reduce experimental uncertainty. Give enough detail so another student could replicate the experiment. And what I'm going to do here is go through steps that I think would be, things that you would want to say for this experiment. So first off, let's say you probably want to say that you'll need to place a box at the top of the ramp. You release it from rest, and you want to record a velocity time graph using the motion sensor. So just kind of a basic statement of what you're going to do. You should say that you're going to somehow use software then to determine the value of the best fit line to the linear data that you've obtained. This is the acceleration, and it's important to say that. You do not need to talk about the details of the software. You don't have to talk about pushing the start button or the stop button or logging into the computer, but you may say that you need a computer, that's fine, and that you're going to be collecting your velocity time data with it, and you're going to use it to find a best fit line. So don't get overly detailed in terms of the mechanics of starting the computer up and everything, but just talk about what measurement you're going to make. Then you probably, if you're a good experimentalist, you're going to repeat this measurement 5 times. Why 5? I don't know. It's better than 2. 10 is probably a lot to do, so 5 is probably a good number. And you're just going to repeat it 5 times under the same conditions using an empty box. And the importance of this is that you're then going to use that to find an average. And finding an average is a way of reducing your experimental uncertainty, so that an average is always better than a single measurement. So being specific and talking about taking an average is important, and saying that you're going to take multiple trials. After you've done that for the empty box, you would add mass to the box, and you repeat the steps above. And I just put down that you should try this for 5 different masses. Again, 5 is just kind of made up. There's nothing special about it. But the idea is that you're showing the person who is reading that you are deliberately changing the mass. Because after all, you want to see if the mass affects your acceleration. And so finally, what you could say then would be that once you have the data, you can compare the average accelerations as mass is increased to see if there's a relationship between acceleration and mass. So this procedure is very specific. It walks you through what you have to do. It tells you what you have to measure and what you're going to use to measure it. And then it talks about the fact that you're going to take multiple trials and that you are going to also vary an experimental variable, which is the mass. And so I think that if you were to find and compare this answer with the points that we talked about in the rubric, you're going to see that we hit every single one of those things. Okay? All right, let's look at the other way, or one other way that you could actually do this experiment. And in the second way, what we're going to do is we're going to use a ruler and 2 photo gates. Now, I will say that there are probably 2 or 3 experiments that you can do with this equipment, but I'm just going to describe one. So this isn't the only answer, but this is probably, I would say this is probably the most direct way to do this. So for our diagram in this experiment, why don't we put the photo gates at 2 positions on the incline, and the box is going to be up at the top, and we'll let it go. So the box is going to pass through the first photo gate, and then the second photo gate. And when it passes through, we're going to use the photo gates to measure those velocities. This will be an initial velocity, this would be a final velocity. We can talk about that in the procedure. But you should expect that the velocity will increase because the box is accelerating down the ramp. So V final should be bigger than V initial. The other thing that we'll indicate in the diagram is that we're going to use a ruler to measure the distance between those gates. That distance is actually going to be the displacement of the cart. That's going to be delta x for the box. And so we'll measure that distance that the box travels, and we're going to use that as our displacement. So again, our diagram indicates that we're using photo gates here and here. The photo gates will give us velocities, and then the ruler will measure the distance between the gates, and that is our displacement. Okay, so I'm going to just kind of scroll through some of the points that you can talk about. Notice that in this example and in the other example, I just used bullet points. That's okay. You can always do that. In fact, it's probably easier rather than writing a full paragraph. So bullet points are fine. So let's start off by saying that you place 2 photo gates at different locations on the incline. Use a ruler to measure the distance between them. This is the box displacement. So identify that that's what the ruler is giving you. Release the box from rest from any position high enough on the ramp so that it passes through both photo gates. If you choose to release the box from a particular location, you can keep repeating from that location. You can always release it from then. You don't need to, but it's probably good experimental procedure to be consistent. So I'm just going to say here that you should release the box from any position high enough. so it passes through the photo gates. You would determine the initial and the final velocity through each gate by dividing the width of the box by the time that's measured by each gate. So if the gates are just measuring time, which they were for us when we did our experiments, you would actually need to measure this width, W, and divide that by the time to find the times. So it's not bad, probably not a bad idea to mark W up here, because remember the time, that distance and the time from the photo gate are what give you the velocity. So you're going to determine the initial and final velocity through the gates by dividing W by T initial, dividing W by T final. Simply, we'll say that how do you get acceleration? You would rearrange the formula, the v squared formula, to solve for A. Okay? And I don't need to do that here. I'm just going to say that that's what I would need to do if I was going to analyze the data. Okay, I have V final, I have V initial, and I have my D. I probably should make this delta x to agree with my picture. Okay, so I have 3 things I know from the experiment and 1 thing I want to solve for. A lot of you were confused on this. I know people who talked about using photo gates didn't quite make the connection to this. And this is important because it makes your experiment conceptually plausible. You have to have some type of formula in mind or some kind of relationship that will allow you to use your information from the lab to make sense and get an acceleration. The remaining points here are kind of a repeat of what we said before. You want to repeat for a total of 5 trials and find an average acceleration and record your results in a table. You want to then add mass to the box and repeat the steps above. Repeat for a total of 5 different masses, record the results in a table. And finally, you want to compare the average accelerations as the mass is increased to see if there's a relationship between acceleration and mass. This last bullet point isn't always necessary. It's kind of understood when you're writing the lab procedure. Sometimes with the procedure, you could probably stop right here, okay? But if you have the extra 10 seconds, it doesn't hurt to kind of just sum up the overall idea of what you're doing, okay? Because that walks the student through things. But in terms of describing the steps that you followed, I think that you'll see that these bullets take you through, and they clearly identify, what you're measuring, what you use to measure it, the steps that you're taking, the fact that you're changing the mass to vary to measure what happens to acceleration, and the fact that you are taking 5 trials to find averages, which helps to reduce uncertainty. So either way that you describe it, either with a motion sensor or with photo gates, we're hitting all those points. Okay, so again, I would encourage you to now take a few minutes and make some notes on your original response and add stuff to it, or make some notes and correct anything if you need to, so that you've got a good example of how to write a lab procedure. Okay, we'll see you in class.